Thank you all. I'm Allister. I'm the Ward 2 member on the DC State Board of Education. I'm also the first Asian American to be elected to this role, and really delighted to get this chance to have this conversation with you all today. When the pandemic first started, my father was one of the people who was assaulted at a grocery store by someone who outwardly blamed him for causing the pandemic because he looks Chinese. And this in-your-face racism, in the same way that, we know more hidden structural racism cannot be solved by education alone, but how we design our education system certainly play an important role. And so for me, this is personal, and I'm very grateful for you all for taking the time to have this conversation and to be working so hard on this work from both of the committees that are with us today. The purpose of the panel is to discuss how we may most effectively introduce students in DC to a wider range of cultures and perspectives, not only race, but also other identity markers, and to explore practical ways in which we may build both the windows and mirrors that we've been discussing into the curriculum. And so first, actually, to help set the stage, I'm going to pass back to you, Alex, just to catch the panelists up on where we are in the process of revising our social studies standards and who the audience is in this current panel and who we'll be sharing the recording with as well.
Of course. Thank you, Representative Chang. And so just some context for both the four panelists, but also members of the Social Studies Advisory Committee and the Technical Writing Committee, and those that will be watching this recording later. The State Board of Education has been embarking on the process by which we're going to revise and update the district's statewide social studies standards since 2019, when the State Board passed a resolution really codifying the importance of creating standards that were going to be anti-racist, that were going to impart, and I'm going to get the language butchered because I don't have it in front of me right now, impart important concepts in early grades, promote civics, education, and I believe there's one additional clause that I am forgetting off the top of my head, and my apologies. From there, the State Board convened a working group to discuss the process by which it would update social studies standards. That working group was a group of elected representatives who then decided to create an advisory committee of members of the city of Washington, D.C., and convening educators, practitioners that would help establish a series of guiding principles by which revised social studies standards in the district would look to. And so there were about 20 guiding principles that our advisory committee drafted. And some of those advisory committee members are in attendance right now for this panel, and others are unable to join, but will be watching the recording later. Worked for about a year on developing those guiding principles. One of which Allister noted is this idea of windows and mirrors and being able to see oneself in the standards, but also at the same time learning about other cultures and folks. And then from there, after the guiding principles were established, they were passed on to the elected state board to vote on. And the elected state board voted on those guiding principles. Those guiding principles have now been sent to our Office of the State Superintendent for Education, our state level education agency, and OSSE, our state level education agency, has convened a technical writing committee of folks who are actually going to be writing those standards. And that is where we currently are in the process. We are actually working with OSSE, and OSSE has convened a group of, I want to say, about 30 folks to work on writing the new standards. And so the folks that are joining the call today, or the panel today, and will be watching the recording in the future, are both members of the advisory committee that the state board convened that worked to get to a place of developing those guiding principles and providing feedback to the state board on what revised standards should look like, as well as members of the OSCE Technical Writing Committee who are actually working on revising the standards right now. Once the standards have been revised, they'll be sent back to the state board for review and approval.
Thank you, Alex. So I'll start by asking folks to introduce yourself, your primary affiliation, and a piece of your work that informs how you'll be speaking to us about preparing students to connect across lines of difference. I'll start in reverse alphabetical order, last name. So Ms. Shieh, if you would start first, thanks.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kat Shieh, she, her, hers. I am currently the anti-hate training coordinator at Asian Americans Advancing Justice. I am based in Chicago. For those of you who may not necessarily know about Asian Americans Advancing Justice, we are a civil rights organization. I oftentimes colloquially like to call us, we're kind of like the NAACP for Asian Americans, and we're also Pan-Asian. Before that, I was an ethnic studies teacher. I taught on the high school level in Los Angeles, and I did that for 5 years. And so, I oftentimes come from, a pedagogical standpoint of, my high school teaching experience. And so oftentimes, when I am talking about what I'm going to be talking about in this panel, I'm really coming from my teaching background and also what I've been noticing in corporate spaces through my anti-hate trainings currently. Before that, I was a congressional staffer. And so I'm coming from a lot of different vantage points here.
Thank you. Dr. Perry?
Hi, I'm Ravi Perry. I'm professor and chair of political science at Howard University. I'm the immediate past president of the Association for Ethnic Studies. We have been around since 1972 advocating for ethnic studies, initially primarily in college and higher education, in the last decade in K through 12 as well. And I'll be glad to talk about some of that work.
Great, thank you. Dr. D?
Hi, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. So my name's Tom D. I'm a professor at Stanford University. Part of what brings me here today is I've been doing work over the last 5 or 6 years studying a pretty thoughtful pilot of a grade 9 ethnic studies course in San Francisco, initially studying its short run effects, more recently with my colleague, Professor Bonilla, who will be introducing herself next, the longer run effects of having taken ethnic studies at that time in high school. And I've done some adjacent work on a similarly themed program in Oakland, and also work within DCPS, part of the recently formed DC Education Research Collaborative. And I've done work previously with a colleague at the University of Virginia, Jim Wyckoff, on the impact teacher evaluation system.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Bonilla.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here as well. My name is Sade Bonilla. I'm an assistant professor in the College of Education at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And along with Professor D, I've been working with San Francisco Unified to look at a pilot program of ethnic studies for 9th grade students. And so I'm happy to speak towards that. And in general, my research and my interests look at different policies and programs that target youth who are not on a path to go to college. And so thinking about how to increase school belongingness and engagement through different policies and programs.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to dive right in, and just reminder that we are at the level currently of setting the standards, so not defining the curriculum. But for folks like you, Kat, who have actually taught ethnic studies, would love to think with you as we get deeper into the conversation about how you worked with the standards that you were given and what that experience was like, right? But as we move forward and as you answer these questions, please keep in mind that it will help us at this stage advise the level of analysis of standards, right? So I think one thing I'd love everyone to answer actually is around thinking through this broader concept, right, of preparing students to understand difference. And, you know, we, I understand has a lot of misunderstanding around what is ethnic studies versus what is critical race theory versus what are other educational options we have to prepare students to understand difference. And so would love if you could take a stab at defining what ethnic studies is relative to the other options, and name some of the other options we have as well. And I'll start with you, Dr. Perry.
Great. Yeah. So I would say simply, ethnic studies is the study in general of non-white populations, histories, and cultures. It's primarily a decolonial project that is designed to say that there is more to say in history and education and politics than that which exists from the Western Eurocentric lens. And so that can take, of course, many forms. It can include Jewish education, it can include Black and Brown education in the United States, it can include African diasporan kinds of issues, it can include Asian Pacific Islander diasporan contexts and issues as well. But generally, the simplest definition, because you could Google it and come up with 20 different ones. The simplest definition is that ethnic studies includes the study of non-white, non-Eurocentric Western philosophies in education. I will say that as a corollary, critical race theory, for example, is not a theory, it's really a project that makes it clear that race is not neutral in the eyes of the law. And of course, anyone who's ever been a minority or marginalized should know that, their politics aside. And so critical race theory is, of course, a political talking point now of certain sectors that has taken over school board rooms across the country now, unfortunately, which is a huge misinformation related to what critical race theory is. It essentially is not, it's not the same as ethnic studies. And as far as we know, it's not taught in any K through 12 setting right now. It's not even taught in most undergraduate settings. It's largely a legal practice that, again, is simply can be defined as looking at the law, not allowing the law to be viewed as neutral, particularly as it relates to race. And so I think that those are the simplest definitions. Otherwise, we could be talking here for 3 hours about what these top concepts are.
So to the other two academics, would you have a different definition for ethnic studies, and would you have other arsenals, other tools in the toolbox that we may turn to think about this broader concept of understanding difference?
So no, that was really masterful. And I think I would just yes-end it by really underscoring what I see in compelling, I think in consensus definitions of ethnic studies is a strong emphasis on critically engaging students in those histories that center populations that have been historically marginalized and often even have some kind of community engagement project as part of them. But what I particularly liked about Professor Perry's characterization, because it's relevant to the work that's been going on in California recently, is his capacious view of how, you know, which groups might get centered might depend on where this course is being taught and for whom. And that's been a source of considerable controversy in California. I know we're focused on standards and not so much curriculum, but California has had considerable controversy over developing a model ethnic studies curriculum and trying to figure out who is represented and how are they represented within that model curriculum. So that capacious and very contextualized view of it, I think, is compelling and important.
So, Dr. Bonilla, would you have anything to?
I would just agree. I agree with both, and I would just add that that ethnic studies curriculum often centers student identity as a starting place for understanding. the broader context around discrimination and prejudice in society. And so sort of starting with the person, right? So this is why there is an emphasis on who is going to be taught and what groups you might center in the curriculum. And I would just say that different school districts have taken different approaches. They've created sort of Chicano, Latino specific courses, African American specific, Asian specific, and then there's ethnic studies specific that will cover different groups. But I think that they all really promote critical awareness of social issues and think about social justice and how to sort of promote social justice, how to act on sort of what they've learned about discrimination and injustice to be sort of the change in the world. So I think those are important components as well.
I want to come back to this point around sort of, ethnic studies broken down into particular identity buckets and what that's looked like and how that works in other contexts. But first to Kat, would love your take on this as a practitioner and not an academic, and also how your students saw ethnic studies defined in your classes.
Sure. Yeah, I think based off of what I'm hearing a lot of, it sounds like there's a lot of understanding and knowing, whereas I think my experience as a practitioner is like, how much does ethnic studies really spur people into action, right? From what I know of from my training with the Association of Rasa Educators, multiculturalism is on its most conservative part of the spectrum of like ethnic studies, right? And then abolitionist education is on its most liberal. Right. And so the way that I sort of see it is, as what like Dr. Bonilla was saying of like, affinity and diaspora based courses, right? Like that would be in my head on the multicultural spectrum of like, how are we understanding difference? How do we get to know people who are like or unlike us? Right. That doesn't really dismantle systems necessarily. Whereas abolitionist education on the other end would really be questioning the systems to a T to say, why do we study certain people? And how are people affected from our political and social and economic systems? And how much do we actually want to dismantle these systems and disparities and privileges? So we actually are thinking like, why do we have uniforms? Why do we have bell schedules? Why do we have this kind of segregation that create, these unequal experiences in lives? And how much do you really want to change that and screw it up, for a lack of a better phrasing? That's sort of my understanding of things. And I think for me, it was really trying to like spur kids into sort of like the liberatory or sort of abolitionist sort of a viewpoint of things, because it wasn't simply understanding like here's the history of Asian Americans, right? But I really wanted, as an Asian American who taught non-Asian students, it really became sort of this idea of like, where can we find our understandings of difference? And I also want you as non-Asians to actually find shared experiences with someone who looks like me, so we can actually stand in solidarity with each other and like spur folks into action and understand that like gentrification does harm all of us, that like white supremacy does harm all of us. And what kind of systems do you want to be a part of, or how much do you not want to be a part of the system in order to really challenge our unfairness in this country? I hope that made sense as a practitioner.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah. And I think the question that raises for me that I would love the other panelists to comment on is actually, what are the other gradients or variables that we could look at different ethnic studies standards through? If we have multiculturalism versus abolitionism as one, spectrum that Kat mentioned, what are some other ways that we can assess and compare different ethnic studies standards in different states?
So I would say, there hasn't been that I know of a formal research done that compares the standards in various states. I do have a series of data that I can share that I've done that kind of shows a general nationwide landscape now, but it's mostly anecdotal from my own research. and is obviously ongoing. I would, which I love about this, I would push back a little bit on what Kat said, and even the idea of having to categorize and figure out what the gradations of ethnic studies may be. And I take that perspective as a political scientist, and that I think much of the coloring, no pun intended, of that comes along with ethnic studies is really about how people interpret what they think ethnic studies is within the social political landscape of the current time in which they're living. And so that ends up being very political, right? And so the notion, for example, that multiculturalism is more of the conservative end, that certainly would be the position theoretically of organizations like Critical Ethnic Studies Association, for example, which has taken a claim on that stake. I would argue, as the former president of the Association for Ethnic Studies, and this is controversial, but I've argued this for years and I will continue to do so, there's no difference between ethnic studies and critical ethnic studies. And I think it's important that we understand that some of these organizations have theoretically sought to create wedges within the broader field of ethnic studies, which I think has actually hindered Americans' consciousness of what ethnic studies is, which is why to this day, 89% of ethnic studies, anything, exists west of the Mississippi River, because that narrative has not made it east of the Mississippi River, largely, I would argue, because there has been so many competing interests. Like for, you know, when our organization started in 1972, it was the only organization. Obviously, in the last 50 years, a lot more organizations have changed. So we have people who do ethnic studies from a, let's say, a research point of view, right? But actually don't go to ethnic studies conferences, and don't really see themselves as ethnic studies scholars. They see themselves as Latinx scholars or Native American scholars or disability and queer studies scholars, or whatever it may be that they think fits under that umbrella. I take up the time to say all that because I know we're talking about standards today. And I think that there is a set of standards that we can say that are shared across states. And I can go through some of that, which I imagine most of you probably know. But right now,
before we dive into the state-specific cases, just zooming out one level, right? You know, and I appreciate the pushback, and I hope you will continue to do that amongst the four of you in this conversation. You know, at the very macro level, I think for this writing committee, right, for our standards, who may or may not be, as you are, you know, experienced practitioners or academics in ethnic studies, right? As we look at, before we start looking into the case studies from other states, as we look at them, right, how do we even start to think about grouping what we're seeing from other states and what we're learning from them? If you're saying that they're, you know, and I understand at the macro level, right, and at the political science level, that very process might be self-destructive, but from the practitioner's perspective of someone who's writing, right? How do we start to think through what to look at and how to look at what other states are doing?
I would love to hear what my colleagues say, but I would recommend we can examine by either states that have requirements and those that have elective courses. So that's one clear distinction. And the other distinction would be, I would say, grade level. And so I know, for example, there in Chicago, there's like an elementary school that kind of requires ethnic studies, but there are, you know, but it's not, you know, district wide, for example, whereas in a lot of places in California, it's largely been based on grades 9 through 12. And so I think focusing on the grade level and focusing on whether it's a requirement situation or an elective course situation, I think would help clarify.
And Dr. D. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add, my recommendation to the board would be, as you undertake this work, you know, informed by what Dr. Perry was just describing, there are two things I'd like to stress really as kind of top line sorts of advice from me. I mean, one is don't necessarily view where you end up landing based on that kind of inquiry as something you've chiseled into a stone tablet. Rather, view it as a point of departure and plan to learn. I think one of the things we habitually fail to do in education, to the great detriment of our children, is to have what is sometimes called an improvement science mindset. To say, like, we're going to articulate something, but then really get into the hard work of thinking about, is it working? Do we need to adapt? And the second part of that is this bleeds towards, Kat's practitioner focus, is thinking about how you support teachers in effectively implementing what happens. I think that is uniquely critical in this space, because if we're talking about sending teachers into the classroom to have honest, critically minded discussions about some of the most painful episodes in US history, I think that calls for teacher craft of a particularly high order. And I worry as California moves to a rather rapid scale up of ethnic studies, that there are going to be a lot of classrooms in which those discussions go sideways really quickly. So again, you're going to make the best judgment you can about where these standards are. But again, I want to underscore this idea of revisit them, have a inquiry mindset about improving them, and really invest heavily in thoughtful, kind of networked ways to support teacher capacity to really implement this well.
And I'll add that the curriculum is one piece, but certainly the strong pedagogy that we saw implemented in San Francisco was another piece. Teachers had time to work with each other on the curriculum, to discuss the different points that they were, that they were teaching in the classroom, to revise the curriculum. So even over time, the teachers have had the space, time, and support to revise the curriculum and make changes based on what they've been seeing in the classroom. So that sort of improvement science that that Tom is talking about not only happens at sort of the policy level, but it also happens within the teachers. And I think that given sort of the exposure to these lessons on critical awareness, and is just the pedagogy is going to be incredibly important, and making sure to support that development in the professionals who are responsible for having those conversations with students is going to be, I think, really critically important.
I hear that, and I think that this is a whole conversation around how we best support our educators. How have you seen that take form in this level, the standards work? When is that done well, or I guess what is the process through which you've seen this done well at this stage of the work?
Who was that for?
All four of you. I'm just trying to bring it back to standards. Because what I'm hearing, Dr. Bonilla, is that the execution matters, right? And I think for us to be really thoughtful about how we actually plan this execution and design the specific curriculum, right? But when it comes to the current work that the writing committee is focused on right now, and and maybe this is a question for you, Kat, how did you interact with the standards as a teacher, and where did it inform you and guide you well, and where did you see it fall short?
Just to clarify, that's to me now, correct? Sorry. Okay. All right. So just to be very clear, I did not work with standards. And I think that's part of like my journey with ethnic studies. I have been pilot everywhere I've gone. So I was one of the first ethnic studies teachers for LA Unified and for 2 other charter networks. One charter network actually eliminated the class after I had left. So I think that this is a huge uphill battle. Dr. Tracy Buenavista of CSU Northridge has written about what's called forced disappearance, which is what I felt like was the understanding of my own experience, that ethnic studies teachers are oftentimes most at stake when it comes to job security because of what we do and what we teach and what kind of uproar it causes in the community and amongst the school staff. So I felt like I loved what I taught. It was tenuous at best. What I was given, my first year of teaching ethnic studies was in LA Unified. I was given an online module where it said, what you want to create is a half-year course where you have 4 weeks of African-American studies, 4 weeks of Asian studies, 4 weeks of Native studies, and 4 weeks of Latinx and Hispanic studies, 2 weeks of LGBTQ studies, and then 2 weeks of self-identity. I personally do not agree with that execution, while also recognizing that there are many people who prefer that execution. I just felt like it did not really create intersectionality, and it did not necessarily create like a thread of how identities like come together and are more complex, but rather it kind of felt like identities were kind of put in neat little slices of a pizza pie, so to say. And I also felt like it was very unfair for people who identify as like biracial and multiracial, of like, oh, I'm going to spend 4 weeks on like Black people and now we're done talking about them. It just felt like very unnatural to me, I think. And so like, I know that there are some school districts that actually like have themes instead of identities as units. That was something that I tried my best to do. And I think what kind of makes it messy is that, you know, we were talking about, you know, later on in the conversation, it seems like we're going to be talking about states. But what we're also noticing is that like school districts are trying to like implement this first, and then like California is trying to catch up with the school districts. And there's a lot of different approaches, and which approach is going to be the best, which approach is going to be the most advisable. I know is definitely something that California has gone back and forth on, like, I don't know, 5 to 7 times in state legislature. And so I think that it's really, really messy work. In the last charter network that I worked for, we had what was called curriculum specialists. I do think that that does fall short because, you know, again, where's the accountability? Just to give you an example of something that I personally did not agree with, and right, this is where curriculum specialists don't always have, you know, the expertise, is I had a curriculum specialist that created lesson plans. And the question of the day, the essential question for that lesson was, why do Asian Americans care so much about education? I felt like that was a very leading question. AAPI data and Dr. Karthik Ramakrishnan also says that like, actually, like Asian Americans caring about education is like, actually, Dr. Perry is like shaking his head, is actually a myth to dispel. So that was the essential question. And then the primary readings were The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother by Amy Chua and Confucius Values. And the idea was that Asian American kids and Asian American families care more about education than Latinx and Black folks because of their Confucius values. Even like right now, like I have like a physical reaction to this. This was written by an Asian American. This was written by someone who was specifically tasked to create ethnic studies curricula. There is no accountability in this. And on top of that, I would argue that ethnic studies teachers are oftentimes like left to the dust in school, on their school campuses. They are the only ones without the backing of their principals or counselors. I was told to not talk about mental health because I would drive kids to suicide. And these are things that are not backed, but very much isolates a teacher. And so I want to make sure that not only are we supporting teachers, but we need to make sure that every single faculty member is on board of having this course, because I think a lot of schools are quite frankly in over their heads.
And I just want to thank you, Kat. And I just want to be clear that, you know, we are potentially weaving this into our social studies standards. We may not have an ethnic studies course, right? And so part of this conversation I want to be thoughtful about is how are we as DC at this stage, what can we learn from your research, from your experiences, from what other states are doing, right, to best build our social studies standards in a way that incorporates those learnings into what we're doing. And one thing that, but before I dive into sort of this theme that Dr. D, you touched on, and I would love to hear more about the research that you and Dr. Bonilla have done together, as well as, broadly, how are we assessing our students' learning how to connect across difference, and, are we doing that well? Are we not doing that well, right? I'm going to flag a comment from someone from one of the committees whose Zoom handle is William J. Watkins Senior Educational Institute. When you were speaking, Kat, saying that each ethnicity deserves its own course, and all of these are, I know, super complex themes. We can't answer it very quickly, but this is something I wanted to come back to you on also, Dr. Bonilla, when you mentioned, having a Latinx course versus an AAPI course, and so just commenting on sort of how do we unpack these identities and make sure that certain school districts actually focus on each one without necessarily naming them, and actually maybe creating some intersectionality at the same time, and actually weaving it all in. I know that's a lot, but any of those pieces that you can reflect on.
Well, I think, I think that part of the controversy that's been engendered by all of these discussions has been everybody wanting to sort of make sure that their group or the people that they care about are named in a specific way, because that sort of signifies that there's some value, right, to having that identity. And of course, everyone wants to be included. And so I'm not going to sort of argue that we shouldn't be trying to include people. But what I will say is that in focusing on standards, and this is my opinion, I think that thinking about making standards related to social justice content, to the sort of the components that we have sort of seen present in this sort of highly effective ethnic studies pilot in San Francisco, there was a big emphasis on social justice, anti-racism, talking explicitly about stereotypes, talking about contemporary social movements, talking about the history of historically marginalized communities, promoting students' critical awareness around these different social issues, talking about civic engagement and giving students examples of being involved in the community and how students can identify and see problems in their community and what they can do, steps they can take to address those problems. So community involvement, that sort of, as I talk about all these things, the things that I see as most important is not whether there was 2 weeks spent on Latinx students versus 3 weeks spent on African-American students, but that we can sort of use student identities as an entryway. We do want to make sure that students see themselves reflected in the curriculum, right? That to me seems to be the really important part. Students should have an opportunity to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. So when Kat talks about sort of intersectionality, there has to be some amount of flexibility for teachers to be able to incorporate the experiences of the students sitting in front of them and engaging them, because I think that's really what we saw in ethnic studies seems to be critical in promoting student belonging, right? For students to lean in to the educational experience and for that to follow them in their other classes, right? For it not to just be something in ethnic studies, but something that they sort of gain and that they can take and move forward with, right? So that it's not just, they might take another class, right? They might sort of be engaged in their academic experience in a way that they wouldn't have been before. And I think that you talk a lot about understanding difference. And I think that we would see this as like an introduction to that work, right? And it's a lifelong experience, right? We're going to constantly sort of encounter. So we're trying to give students the tools that they need to sort of understand discrimination, understand the sort of historical aspects of it, law and all these other things that sort of make it up, so that students can unpack these issues and understand the structural nature of them, in addition to sort of the day-to-day experience and how stereotypes and bias manifest. And so at least for the standards point of view, I would I would focus on those higher level goals that I think seem to me to be so powerful in terms of what makes the ethnic studies curriculum really transform a lot of students.
Right, and actually coming back to you on this, right, on as we think about goals, I mean, necessarily we're also thinking about how do we know if we've reached them, right? And so as we think about naming these goals and making them explicit in the standards, right, and maneuvering how to articulate those goals, would love to hear from folks. How do we know if we're doing a good job? And how do we know if what we're doing is not working?
I just had something that I wanted to chime in. It doesn't quite directly answer the question, but it does add on to what Dr. Bonilla was saying about how like students want to like see themselves like and feel like they are valued in this. I think one of the traps within like practicing and teaching ethnic studies is I mean, let's be frank, like the history is like a little depressing. And oftentimes like there can be feelings of despair, like within ethnic studies, because there is so much injustice that you are learning about. I think it can be really tricky that sometimes ethnic studies is only like the sole focus is about like unfairness within our systems and like oppression, and like non-white people are not defined only by our depression and only by the history of victimhood, or like even thinking about how like history is still told through like the losses of non-white folks, but really making sure that we are also seen as like complex and brilliant and flawed people and our injustices, rather than only focusing on like all the bad things that have happened to us, while also making sure that we're not tokenized by saying like, here's like the one Asian that like did something amazing, right? Like making sure we sort of have that balance is pretty nuanced. And I had a lot of difficulty trying to figure out where do I want to fall on the spectrum of like not wanting to tokenize, but not wanting to only have our stories and narratives be about losing and the bad things that have happened to us, because we are much more powerful than that.
I would echo that in terms a little bit in terms of the classrooms themselves, the classes rather themselves. I would just encourage that when you're thinking about standards, we don't have to just create separate courses that speak to particular identities. I think that's one way to do ethnic studies. I think another way to do it, which is I think creates more opportunity for intersectionality. One, there should be a course on ethnic studies. That's what creates intersectionality. It's much easier to become separated if you create these separate courses. Beyond that, I would say that I totally agree about the concepts. So if you look at a lot of state board of education across the country, concepts that are, you know, they define the concepts and then they define like the concept for that particular level, right? So if you're doing social justice for a 3rd grade classroom versus social justice for a 10th grade classroom, right? The theme may be the same, but the bullet points that you're measuring for will be different, given the critical status of the student group. And particularly, I would say if it is at the 9 through 12 level, most states and cities have started with the 9 through 12 level. Those students are old enough to do their own evaluations, which I think is actually a good practice because they don't have to do it in college anyway. And they're allowed to evaluate, and obviously that will mean creating an instrument of evaluation that we agree on is shared and equitable, et cetera. But it's assuming that can happen, then we will have the data to say, okay, well, this isn't working so well, this may be working. I would encourage the same thing with instructor evaluation, where they should be required to do their own self-assessment of how effective they think they have been at achieving these topics. The reason why I think that's so important is because it really does get to the sustainability question. One thing we're very proud of in Association of Ethnic Studies is that we've been around since 1972. If you want to be honest, the vast majority of ethnic studies programs that started in the 60s and 70s have closed. And there's reasons for that. A lot of the reasons have to do with politics. and that we don't in many ways train teachers to walk the fine line between teaching the discipline of ethnic studies and teaching perhaps their personal politics that might relate, but that for some people, of course, creates opportunities to strike down the importance of ethnic studies. So I think the concepts are great, whether it be social justice, anti-racism, civic engagement. We can certainly create measures for what that looks like in terms of curriculum mastery. But in general, I think it's really important that the goal, I think, the answer to the question of when do you think we've been successful, I think the goal is we've reached a certain level of critical analysis relative to those topics that fits that particular age group. And we've seen some of that, I think, in some of the state efforts nationwide that have been more effective. But I do want to really push how important that is, not just because we want the teachers to be the best trained, but I hate the word training, but you know what I mean, the best prepared, what have you. But it's also, it is about the sustainability of it. We don't want ethnic studies to be something that we just do for a couple of years and then it drops away when it gets out of the media, right? This is which is some reason why I think it's important to emphasize that this is a discipline. It's an actual study. It's not just, you know, a discussion of multicultural groups and, you know, a discussion forum or a shared group setting or something. And so the reason why that's important is also because if the teachers are appropriately trained and they know the right measures that they will be assessed on in terms of how they're producing this content in their classrooms, then that also will ensure the greater sustainability of the program. And in terms of the board and of the public's impression, it will improve the public support of the program, which from the beginning is not likely necessarily to be fully supportive. And my last comment here would be, I would encourage us to pay attention to the context. Here in DC, obviously 68% of the students in the school, 70% are Black, about 20% are Latino, Latinx. And so in most programs, ethnic studies began as an effort for a particular group. So for example, my dad founded ethnic studies at Bowling Green. It began as an African American studies minor, major, that then ballooned into ethnic studies. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. Some places created ethnic studies deliberately, others created them as a result of compromise. But in general, most of it has all been established. And I think this is an important point, since we're thinking about establishing this obviously in DC, which is a majority minority district. Much of ethnic studies has been established initially in places that are not majority minority. And that is just an interesting thing to keep in context of when we're talking about the politics involving this, because we want to make sure that this lasts for more than just a couple of years.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. I've got a couple questions that folks have typed to me in the chat that I want to flag. But before we run out of time, because I've been saying I want to hear this from Dr. D and Dr. Bonilla since the beginning, would one of you be willing to share a bit about your most recent research first, and what kinds of takeaways might help inform our current work in DC?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in on that. So we studied quantitatively the pilot ethnic studies course in San Francisco Unified. It was a grade 9 course. As an aside, we think the grade 9 targeting may have been critical, because one of the ways in which we theorize ethnic studies supports educational excellence is by lifting kids up, giving them a kind of psychological buffer when their social identity in a new school setting is at its most threatened, its most malleable. And grade 9 is a famously vexed year in kids' transition. So that design feature may be a critical one you want to be aware of. Those transition points are points where you could really sort of lift kids up. So we studied its impact initially just on end of grade 9 outcomes and found substantial effects. That was a 2017 paper. But there's lots of evidence that there's fade out of things that have short run benefits. So Professor Bonilla, who seems to have some internet problems and dropped off, she really led this effort to study the longer run effects. Those cohorts, which we were taking the course in the about 10 years ago, have now aged enough that we could observe them through high school graduation and into college entrance. And so we examined that and found that the ninth grade effects we found did not fade out. They sustained throughout high school. And this is really consistent with, I mean, a number of literatures, but what it really strikes me as corresponding with is a social psychological literature that talks about some of the things we see in ethnic studies really being powerful ways to catalyze student engagement and recursive processes of academic success and attainment. The idea of, like, you know, giving kids stereotype forewarning, you know, in classroom environments where they historically feel threatened, giving them affirmation of their values, giving them a sense of social belongingness, giving them external attribution for some of the life challenges they face. There's a huge corpus of experimental psychological interventions, just little 10-minute interventions that show that things targeting those mechanisms really support students' capacity to learn. When we look at ethnic studies, as San Francisco did it, we see something that combines all of those social psychological supports and delivers them intensively for a 180-day school year. So anyway, we're really excited about those results. We think it's a compelling proof point, but we're also aware it was a small scale pilot. So the challenge to replicate the success of that, I think, are really non-trivial, but definitely something we should be pursuing aggressively, given what we're seeing from that evidence.
One question I just got from in the chat was around more specifics, Dr. D, if you're willing to share on what the positive effects are, and then also how would you even explain the causal piece, right? Is it offering ethnic studies? Dr. Bonilla mentioned how important it is to do the execution piece right? How do you think about the inputs and specifically what the outputs are that you were looking at in this case?
Yeah. So first on the outcomes, we studied a number of things. We studied grade point average. By the way, grade point average outside of social studies, because one potential criticism is, well, oh, these soft ethnic studies scores, aren't they just grade inflated? And if you see a higher GPA, isn't it just due to that? No, we found higher GPA in math and in science and in ELA. Second, attendance. We're all of us educators are grappling with this renewed awareness around social emotional learning, but I think we don't know very well how to measure it yet. And so a lot of state accountability systems have turned to attendance and chronic absenteeism as measures of that. And we relied on that and found sustained gains in student attendance from students who were quasi-experimentally. I mean, these are really causally credible estimates, gains for students who took ethnic studies. Third, we looked at credit accumulation. These are all the key flags that allow us to know, is a student on track to high school graduation? And then Professor Bonilla's leadership on the more recent project was finally able to look at high school completion. We found that, again, those gains in attendance, credit accrual, GPA existed throughout high school. And then thankfully, we saw really substantial gains in high school completion, and even some intimation that these students, and our focal sample of students were really students who were struggling academically in 8th grade. Yet we even saw evidence that they were more likely to matriculate in college. So really an encouraging proof point, but again, one whose replication is not guaranteed if we don't pursue it thoughtfully.
Right, and if we don't, right, if the input is an ethnic studies course, if I may ask you to, and I understand that this is a challenging given all the elements that are involved with, as you mentioned, leading to those outputs and outcomes. But if we aren't to offer an ethnic studies course in DC, what are some of the elements of what you saw in the inputs that you were measuring and looking at that we should be thoughtful of that can lead to those outcomes?
Yeah, so at the standards level, it's clearly cultural relevance, and it's clearly some SEL components. And I was struck by Kat's comment that sometimes the piecemeal approach doesn't work. And I saw in San Francisco's ethnic studies course, some of those SEL theme components were kind of a connective glue that drew together the different identities. So for example, one of the lessons in the San Francisco course was what are stereotypes and how do they shape my subjective experiences in the world? And the Oakland program I've studied, the African American Male Achievement Program, similarly had a very heavy social emotional component about, your identity and how do you define manhood and things of that sort. So, so cultural relevance, SEL components can really be an important part of this, but then it really becomes, I think, about things that are beyond standards. It becomes about the actual curriculum and even more critically, teacher practice, the pedagogy in the classroom, the environment they create. And I want to underscore one thing, because you're looking for exemplars from other states. San Francisco really kind of bled across writing standards, designing curriculum, and supporting teacher practice. They had a state board proclamation around 2008, let's develop ethnic studies and explore this, driven by community demand. But then they empowered a motivated group of about a dozen history teachers to work with outside technical support from the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State. And they engaged in iterative work that moved across standards curriculum and classroom practice. They talked about standards, they developed corresponding curriculum and lesson plans. They went into their classrooms, delivered them, then came back to the group to discuss. And then they repeated that several times before our evaluation window with the grade 9 course they developed even opened. I don't know if that's institutionally feasible for you, but boy, from where I sit, what a compelling model for knitting together standards into practice.
That's interesting, and certainly gets to, I mean, you're leaving us with a lot of questions around not just how we write the standards, but the process and how we execute it. And I will say we've gotten a few questions now. I've gotten a few questions, even though this is not directly tied to the writing of the standards, around this question about how we support educators. So I know you touched on it. So, and I kind of shut it down because I thought it was not necessarily directly relevant to this conversation, but we have been hearing from folks that it is interesting for them. So if that's something that we could come back to, Dr. Bonilla, I know you mentioned it as well. What you're finding is a good way to, I need to be thoughtful about the word choices I use with three academics here. Not just the process, but actually how do we support educators in this work? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak to what we saw San Francisco do that I think Tom just sort of summarized. But certainly the teachers were the professionals who were doing the work of creating the curriculum and then testing it out, modifying it for their students, and then coming back to the drawing table. And these are good teaching practices, right? That you try out lessons, you revise them, and that you have support. And so that there is sort of that institutional support. And I think it's it's important that if you're sort of thinking about infusing ethnic studies, maybe principles or standards across the curriculum versus having a standalone course. And I think that one piece around creating the course is that you sort of say, we're going to stop doing something else, and we're going to put our resources around teacher training, around offering courses, right, for this particular right. And I know that teachers often feel like they're being asked, and do this on top. Okay, now add this, now add this, now add this. And it's impossible, right? We have to sort of take some things off the plate and give people the professional courtesy to develop their skills in a new area, if that's what we're asking them to do. And I think that, unfortunately, this sort of teaching, the teaching about these different communities has not been something that the vast majority of teachers are familiar with. But there are many teachers who have taken ethnic studies courses in higher education and who do have expertise and do have interest. And so I think empowering teachers at the same time to know that there is some expertise and you can utilize that, I think is really important. And that's what San Francisco did. There were a couple of teachers who were at San Francisco State and knew some of the professors in the College of Education, right? And they were able to bring that to their colleagues and do that in a really collaborative way. So I think that's important as you guys think about it. We always ask teachers to do this thing and that thing, and their response is like, well, this is just a fad, it's going to end, right? And I think Dr. Perry was talking about this too, right? If you don't want to do it for just 1 or 2 years, you have to think about the sustainable nature of it, and it's going to take time to develop those skills in your teaching force and sustain it and grow it.
So a specific question I got in the chat was, is it through instructional materials? Is it through coaching? Is it pre-service programs? What is a good way for us to actually go about supporting teachers to learn how to implement this well, right? And whether that be a separate ethnic studies course, and I see the value you're saying in that it's deliberately, it's more deliberate, but both that way and also the way of weaving it through the existing curriculum.
I would say that and if it's not too much work, it should be both and all of the above. I certainly know, and I think I can speak for dozens of ethnic studies professors across the country, that if they were tasked with doing a community workshop with their local school district teachers on what ethnic studies is and how to teach it in your classrooms, that people would probably do that for free or little to no cost, because it's part of who they are, it's part of what they want to do. And there are several national associations that could easily create that list of dozens of people in each state that could be utilized for that purpose. And so I'll shut up by saying, what ethnic studies is not. It is not the classroom projection of your own non-white experience. And I think for some places where it has failed, that's what it had at least been interpreted to have become. And so I think it's really important to study the failures. So far, it has failed in Arizona and it has failed in Kansas. So I think it's worth looking at those states to see why it failed in those locations and the extent to which it failed, because it varies. But ultimately, teacher prep and teacher support, I think, begins with not assuming that simply because they're a teacher that has this interest or the teacher that's from a marginal background, that they know what ethnic studies is. So we need to educate the teachers first.
Ms. Shieh, I would love to hear from you about sort of from the practitioner's perspective as well. And I saw you had a facial reaction to Dr. Perry when he mentioned those other 2 states. So if you have a comment on those 2, I'd love to hear it.
What happened in Arizona is actually my first unit of my class. The history of ethnic studies itself, in a funny way, it could also guilt students to say you should be appreciative of this class because it's literally not allowed. But at its best, it's to also understand that, like, studying race and identity is not simply what's like a cultural phenomenon, but understand that there are people who are actively creating our legal systems that allow or not allow solidarity to happen, to allow liberatory education to happen, right? And so, anyways, that's sort of a tangent. I think it's so important for us to really understand the political landscape of what is happening and what is not happening, because ethnic studies right now is still a minority sort of phenomenon, right? Like, of the 5,000 higher ed institutions, including community colleges, like, we're looking at less than 400 have ethnic studies departments. Why do places like Northwestern not create departments, but just cycle through instructors and deny tenure to so many different professors, and then wonder why we don't have ethnic studies as like a larger phenomenon? Right, like in our society, right? And so I think it's important for us to really understand the political systems that stop us from creating like a larger movement, right? And this movement has lasted so long. But anyways, going back to sort of the practitioner standpoint, you were talking about, can you repeat the question just one more time?
How can we best support educators to
Right.
implement this well? Right.
Yeah. So to be quite honest with you, I actually would like even challenge that question. Right. I interpret that, kind of what Dr. Bonilla was saying about like just adding things onto teachers. What I really missed about, like working in politics and then becoming a teacher, when I worked in politics, people thought I was smart. When I became a teacher, people thought I was dumb, but a good person, right? I didn't have a lot of intellectual capital, but a lot of moral capital in which people were saying like, oh, like you do this because you're patient and you care about kids, right? And, then I always respond with, have you seen my personality? Anyways, but really, really thinking about the fact that we just like continue to have this top down notion of we can train anti-racism into a person, right? Whereas Dr. Bonilla was kind of saying like, there is expertise out there already, right? And I think also adding to this that like, it's not simply about, implementing these standards or implementing and creating this course in a sustainable way, but making sure that it is responsive to the geographic environment it is in. I don't want you to think about creating ethnic studies or more socially just courses. But what would that mean to create an ethnic studies curriculum that is responsive to the history of DC? I think that is so cool, right? Not just thinking about ethnic studies as a whole, but how I interpret what has happened in San Francisco and what has happened in LA. They're allowed to be two different phenomenons. And it's okay for me personally to not necessarily talk about like racial harmony and intersectionally as a whole, but like what does like multidimensionalism and what does intersectionality look like within the power structures of Los Angeles, because the kids are Angelino, right? And I think that that is something that could be worth exploring. What would ethnic studies not just mean, but what would it mean for this particular set of communities, right? And just to sort of as a tangent, something that I've really been struggling a lot with is the fact that when we're talking about creating ethnic studies as a reality, it is never in majority white spaces. Like I've only seen ethnic studies as a defense of like we can help kids of color, we can help low income kids, it is good for their GPAs, which are still beneficial, right? But Santa Monica canceled their ethnic studies program. I don't hear affluent districts or white districts, really thinking about how to implement these courses unless there's like research that I'm missing here. And the last thing that I do want to say is, like I had mentioned earlier, I want to make sure we're not just focusing on educators. I really want to make sure counselors are supporting the ethnic studies teachers, or else the ethnic studies teachers will be attacked. I want to make sure our admin are completely behind this, so our ethnic studies teachers do feel safe to try out different lessons rather than saying, you failed to create, like nuanced curricula. That is a lot of pressure to put on one person in an entire campus.
Absolutely. And actually, you were touched on another question I got in the chat around whether there's been a history of offering ethnic studies courses in classrooms with pretty homogenous populations, either all white or all black, for example, and how that's looked. If I know, Kat, you touched on this, would the other three of you know of any cases we could look at?
Yeah, I can certainly send some. There are a couple at the K through 12 level. The irony is that how ethnic studies started in the college level was absolutely in majority white spaces. And to this day, minority serving institutions actually are more likely to not have ethnic studies. And so that's the irony, is the K through 12 has teetered on, oh, it's a majority minority district, we need to do this, let's figure out how to do something. But when you get to higher ed, you'll be hard pressed to find ethnic studies at an HBCU or Hispanic serving institution, or including community colleges. And so there are a few examples of homogenous white suburban populations that have attempted ethnic studies, and I will send that list. It's only like 2 or 3 that I know of, but I'll send it.
Thank you. So we're coming up on time. If I may do another round and ask folks, to share, anything I didn't ask you, but a piece of advice for us as we're writing and close out. What should we in DC be thinking about, referring to, reading? What questions? I mean, I think that what my takeaway from this is, I think you're asking a ton of questions that we have touched on and should continue asking. But how would you advise the writing committee broadly, and what have we missed?
Well, Allister, I'll hop in just with a quick comment. I wanted to circle back to a question you asked earlier that I don't think we worked our way around to, which was how do we know if it's working?
Yeah.
And I stressed at the beginning, I think having that kind of improvement science mindset is vitally important. So I don't know if this is within the capacity of you guys as you're writing up this standard, but if there were some way to articulate an expectation that there'll be a learning agenda behind this, because I think that's a better way to kind of yoke ourselves to the incredible promise of this kind of pedagogical innovation, right? Is to embed the notion that we're going to take a first pass, see if it's working, and then revisit based on what we're learning about what is or isn't working, and go back to the drawing board and try again. And in particular, the City Council has just recently, in DC, has just recently authorized the Education Research Collaborative I've mentioned. So you have an extant capacity out there in terms of thought partners and thinking about learning about whether it's actually working.
How much time would you allow for this process, Dr. D?
Well, more is always better, but I realize that none of this occurs in a vacuum. Our first study of the ethnic studies pilots in San Francisco relied only on end of year data that were strongly indicative of longer run effects, but that was enough for the district to feel great about it. And they went to scale district-wide on the basis of that short-term evidence. And I think it contributed some to the momentum statewide, frankly, that led to the model curriculum that was discussed recently, and recent legislation to make it a high school graduation requirement throughout the massive state of California. So it doesn't take, a small amount of really good evidence, I think, could move the needle. But obviously, as a researcher, I think more and better evidence is always welcome. I would particularly like to see evidence not just on canonical student outcomes, test scores and educational attainment, but also on some of the social emotional measures, because we've been arguing that we think those are key mediators, creating psychologically safe spaces in which students can risk being intellectually engaged and motivated. But it would be so powerful to actually have some measures that spoke to that.
Would you kick us off then also with closing remarks, and if you're open to it, sharing some way that we could get in touch with you or learn more about your research in the chat box?
Sorry, was that a question to me or a general?
Yeah, sorry. Was that your closing statement?
Yeah, let's say that was. I'd love to hear from my other panelists.
Thank you. Then I'll pass to Kat.
Sure. I have a couple of things. The first one is, thinking about like what I had mentioned about like geographic specific and community like response of like how we want to craft ethnic studies might look different in different places. And I think that's good for us to imagine. The second thing, really thinking about the success of ethnic studies, I think it is really cool for us to think about like, what would having an A in ethnic studies look like for you? And if a kid got an F in ethnic studies, what would that actually mean, right? And so like really thinking about that, I think is important for us to sort of interrogate if you want to think about like the successes or like what is sort of like a good litmus test or metric for whether or not this class rolls out well. Also inputting that mastery learning and grading should definitely be implemented within ethnic studies. Otherwise you're continuing like disparate educational outcomes. The third is, this is a tool that I used a lot within my practice of ethnic studies. And it's, really making sure that we are not permitting or perpetuating the racialization of issues. The amount of ethnic studies teachers I saw that talked about immigration only as a Latinx issue, I personally found pretty problematic, right? But really thinking like issue first and then thinking about other communities that have been affected, I think can be a really good way to find shared experiences, right? Realizing that immigration is like a Haitian issue and a Latinx issue and an Asian issue, rather than thinking that only certain policy issues affect certain communities. Hopefully that would create nuance for ninth graders, and they can handle it from my experience, right? And then the last thing is, I know that this panel was about specifically understanding difference, and I would challenge that notion. Understanding difference is a means to an end. What do you ultimately want people to do and say and think? And it's not necessarily just understanding difference, I think. It is actually creating new structures or dismantling structures that would ultimately make DC a more equitable place for everyone, right? And I think that that's something that, might be important for the writing committee to really be able to like sort of agree upon and think about, because understanding difference is like the tip of the iceberg. So those were like 4 big points. I'll pass it on to the rest.
Thank you, Dr. Bonilla.
Thanks. I guess I'm just struck by I think the importance of not being sort of over prescriptive about what the standards should cover and leaving some room. And I think part of that is because, what a strong ethnic studies experience is going to look like in different classrooms, and even as the demographics of DC and as the students change, right, it might shift over time. And I think that there has to be room there to allow the standards to sort of to reflect the students who are engaging with them. And I think that part of ethnic studies that to me seems so important is around talking about injustice, but also giving students room to think about how they want to promote a just society, right? Giving them the space to think about that, and the room and the tools, the flexibility to go out into the world and promote a more just world. And so I think that, that might engender discomfort amongst adults of various sort of identities. But I think that's an important part of the learning and the space there. And the other is that the rigor of the course. I think that sort of sidelining ethnic studies as being an elective, I think sort of diminishes I think what it can do, the power that it can have. In San Francisco, it's important to note that it was a year-long course, that it was aligned to the university entrance standards in terms of social studies curriculum, what the 4-year UC system accepts as being a rigorous college-ready course, right? And so this, the sort of the critical nature of the course, the assignments was quite rigorous, and I think that's hugely important for promoting students' academic experience and giving them, we're giving them space, but we're also giving them skills to keep engaging in the high school curriculum. And I think that just the importance around the standards and what's appropriate for the different grade levels is also going to be hugely important, which Dr. Perry has mentioned as well.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Perry, would you wrap us up?
First of all, I want to thank y'all for taking on this engagement. You don't have to. Most school districts have not, and you have, and that in and of itself is something to tip your proverbial hats for. And so really grateful for that, and grateful because we live in a democratic republic that has always been diverse, but has quite never been inclusive. And that is the challenge that we create with ethnic studies. I think here in DC, there are going to be a few challenges. Just one, the nomenclature. You're going to have to educate people about what ethnic studies is here in DC. Most people don't know. I think secondly, as has been discussed, because we are really dealing with ethnic studies in DC, I think a particular a discussion or a public dialogue about what that looks like that includes community voices, I think is central. Because to create a new curriculum that reflects the experiences of people who live here, and for them not to be at least somewhat consulted, or of course will then just create in backlash. And finally, I would encourage that you don't give up hope, because this is not something that is going to be finished, even when you do the standards, even when it's, let's say it's implemented in 6 months, even when that happens, you're going to have to continually have to sell the message to the public. And you might be surprised by who you have to sell it to. I use the example in DC, just since we're in DC, of how many African Americans in DC love the Washington Redskins name, love the Washington Redskins, millions love them, and that is to me the quintessential case of the challenge of ethnic studies in DC. We have to educate sometimes even marginalized people to understand that the study of the shared oppressions of people is something that we all have a responsibility to learn. And simply because I'm a person of color doesn't mean I understand my own experience. And that is something that we do in ethnic studies. And so I would encourage you to continue to be bold, but also be willing to define what ethnic studies is for DC here in the district that, of course, should be a state.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I know we're a bit over time, and really appreciate you sticking with us for this not super linear conversation. And I appreciate getting tangled in it all together, and raising a lot of questions that I know that we'll be continuing to think about. So just to close this out, the Board of Education should be receiving a final draft of the revised social studies standards in the coming month. They'll then go through a public and community comment period, and then we'll vote on them in the spring of 2022. So this conversation is timely and helpful, and really grateful to get this chance to talk with the four of you about this. And to everyone else who's been listening in, thank you for all the work that you're doing with the actual writing, and looking forward to continuing to work with folks. And thank you, Dr. Bonilla, for dropping your contact information in. We'll be sure to share the paper that you and Dr. D worked on as well, and hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.